first make sure that everyone can hear with the microphones. Are we good with the volume? Yeah? Yeah? Great. We know that security is taking a little bit longer, but we also know that we are what is in between you and lunch. So we're going to start, and people will continue to filter in as they can. Well, welcome everyone. This is a panel entitled Antisemitism in Canada, Politics, Fear, and Prejudice. Thank you for choosing to be here for a conversation that is both urgent and complex. I'm Cantor Cheryl Wunch. I'm the spiritual leader of Congregation Shir, Libeynu, and I'm one of the members of the Clergy Advisory Council for the New Israel Fund of Canada, and I'll be moderating this discussion. We are here to elevate progressive perspectives and to take anti-Semitism seriously without flattening it. That means holding to dangerous form of prejudice and the real need for nuance in how we talk about it. What we're getting right, where our language or assumptions go wrong, and how fear can blur the line between actual threat and perceived threats. A brief personal note. As a Jewish leader who cares about a wide, diverse community, I feel the tension of this topic in my own body. It's not simple. But complexity is not our enemy, it's our teacher. This morning, I am asking all of us to practice the kind of listening that makes room for more than one truth at a time. And I want to recognize the diversity of people gathered here. Jews from many backgrounds and traditions, allies from other faiths, and community members who hold very different relationships to Israel and to Canadian civic life. Each perspective matters in this conversation. I want to outline some hopes for our conversation today. We want to honor nuance over slogans. So let's resist easy binaries and attend to evidence, context, and lived experience. Let's be courageous, but with care. Ideas are fair game for criticism, people are not. And let's assume good faith and stay curious. If you feel your temperature rising, pause, breathe, and listen to the complexities.
We'll start because some people are still in security checks, but we don't start. Just want to listen out.
We'll get that.
Because we're all supposed to move to lunch.
My temperature's rising.
Well,
We were saying that we were kind of sad that we were missing the other section. Someone has gone, yeah.
Journalist of the Haaretz for 36 years. Before that, we
Anyone want to do a dance or like
writer, war, peace, and politics. Diplomacy, peace process.
I could just speak louder.
I was there when Leora declared there was no path to peace. Very sad moment. And then the current job, my 15th year as editor-in-chief, where we have
this is going to be very difficult.
Like any other newspaper, news organization, people today editor around the world, the shift from this to this has profoundly changed the profession. And we always need to keep up with this. Social networks, now it's AI. We must keep up to develop the younger generation and to more veterans. And the other issue is specific, particular, proud journalistic mission of Haaretz.
Okay, I think we're good.
Thank you so much.
Oh, now can you do yours?
Yeah, we're good. So we've talked about our hopes for this, nope. It's okay, I can shout.
Yeah, that's okay.
Which is not great for accessibility, but until we get this resolved, I'll just shout. I think it's because we have to turn off the speakers so that we don't hear that. So we can try that. In any case.
For the recordings.
That's not one. No, they're just.
Okay, we're gonna keep going
If you
until.
need to hear, move up their spaces in the front.
Yeah.
Please, move up.
So we were talking about our hopes for this conversation.
Yes, there we go.
The mics are on. The mics are working.
Oh, fantastic.
Are they? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
That's fantastic.
So what we're going to, I'm still gonna shout because I can still hear the other room. What we're going to explore this morning, we're gonna talk about what counts as anti-Semitism in Canadian civic life and culture, and how our definitions shape outcomes. We want to talk about where our discourse is working, successful responses, coalition building, education, and where it's failing. Overreach, vagueness, or weaponized language that shuts conversations down. We want to explore how the public conversation has shifted, what has changed in tone, policy, and in daily life, and how we responsibly distinguish real danger from ambient anxiety. My role is to keep us grounded, brave, and respectful, and to make space for disagreement without dehumanization. Your role is to listen with openness, hold your own convictions lightly enough to learn, and help us build a conversation worthy of the stakes. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful panelists this morning. Shlomit Broder. Shlomit is the CEO of Digital Public Square, a Toronto-based not-for-profit on a mission to rethink and redesign the way technology is used to support communities worldwide. With over 2 decades of experience leading large-scale digital initiatives across both the corporate and nonprofit sectors, she combines expertise in digital technology with a strong commitment to social impact. Shlomit is a passionate advocate for addressing global human rights challenges, a natural bridge builder. She views every day as an opportunity to learn from the diverse perspectives of those around her. Leora Schaefer. Leora is the Executive Director of Facing History and Ourselves Canada. She has worked in the field of education for over 25 years. With a Bachelor of Education from the University of Winnipeg, Leora was a classroom teacher at the start of her career. Leora is driven by the goal that every student across the country will have classroom experiences that inspire them to learn from the lessons of history so that they feel empowered to stand up against bigotry and hate. And Ella Messler. Ella is the Program Associate for the Nexus Project, an American organization committed to combating anti-Semitism, upholding democracy, and protecting free speech. She recently graduated from Brandeis University with a BA in History and Politics. Congratulations. And during her time in college, worked with Jewish on Campus, a student-powered advocacy organization amplifying the voices of Jewish students and combating campus anti-Semitism. She is dedicated to ensuring Jews have a place in progressive spaces and believes a strong, healthy democracy is essential to their safety and flourishing. Welcome, all of you. I'd like to invite each of you to take a few moments and share a little bit more deeply about the work that you do, about yourselves, about what drew you to this work, where your passions lie. Ella, let's begin with you. There we go.
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Ella Messler. I work for the Nexus Project, an advocacy organization combating anti-Semitism. At Nexus, we believe that protecting democracy must be central to the fight against anti-Semitism because a healthy democracy has always been the key to Jewish safety and success. We are witnessing some of the highest levels of anti-Semitic hate in recent memory. Synagogues, schools, and cultural centers have been targeted with swastikas, bomb threats, and deliberate intimidation. On campus, Jewish students report being explicitly targeted for their identities, ostracized from university life for expressing any connection to Israel. And yet, in American politics, our efforts to fight anti-Semitism are stalled. Too often, leaders weaponize Jewish fears for their own agendas instead of truly combating anti-Semitism. For example, the Trump administration is currently cracking down on academic freedom, forcing universities to bend to its ideology and arresting student activists, all under the guise of protecting Jews. There are reports of the Trump administration sweeping the social media of visa applicants to the US and using any pro-Palestinian activism as grounds to deny visas. Several members of the Trump administration have been known to have ties to white supremacists and have even spread white supremacist rhetoric themselves. To contrast the above, in 2023, the Biden administration released the National Strategy to Combat Anti-Semitism, which calls on executive agencies, Congress, and public society to band together to address anti-Semitism, drawing from the perspectives of hundreds of Jewish institutions and leaders. The strategy itself contains a wide array of specific recommendations, ranging from education to the executive branch to Congress to the public sector. The national strategy is a representation of by far the most ambitious and proactive US government effort to counter anti-Semitism in American history. However, the national strategy is no longer our guide to combating anti-Semitism. Instead, the current administration has adopted Project Esther, a Heritage Foundation plan from the same far-right think tank behind Project 2025. Project Esther's only goal is the creation of a legal framework that criminalizes legitimate criticism of the Israeli government and any solidarity with Palestinians, weaponizing Jewish fears as a pretext to dismantle our democratic institutions. And note here that I haven't even covered every single other action the Trump administration has taken that ultimately erodes American democracy. The executive orders, the dissolution of DEI in federal offices, attacks on the Department of Education, and on and on and on. That's why today, we must recommit ourselves to democratic values. Civil liberties, equal protection, free speech, and open dialogue protect not just Jews, but all minorities. Undermining these values in the name of Jewish safety leaves everyone, including Jews, less safe. That's where the Nexus Project comes in. Our advocacy is grounded in the scholarship of the Nexus Task Force, experts in anti-Semitism, Jewish history, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. This gives our work a uniquely analytical and academic focus, grounding it in the reality of where the Jewish community is now and how we got here. Alongside the task force, we've developed resources like the Nexus document, which includes the Nexus definition of anti-Semitism, a campus guide, which helps determine when and where common speech we're seeing on campus can cross the line into anti-Semitism, and a strategy for combating anti-Semitism during the Trump era. The leadership of Nexus was also referenced in the national strategy, representing the perspective of thousands of Jews who both feel anti-Semitism rising and see anti-Semitism weaponized by our political leaders. If I can leave you with one thing, let it be this. Protecting democracy is essential to combating anti-Semitism. History shows us that Jews thrive under strong democratic institutions, and as anti-Semitism rises to historic levels, safeguarding democracy is more important now than ever. That's what we're doing at Nexus, protecting the future of our democracy to protect our future as Jews. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Shlomit, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hosting me, at least, on this important panel. And I will take a second to note it's a fully female panel, which I think is not always the case. My name is Shlomit Broder. I'm sorry, I'm going a little more personal. I'll say 2 words about Digital Public Square. I work for a Canadian, thank you. We are a Toronto-based nonprofit named Digital Public Square. We've been around for about a decade or so, started at the University of Toronto, but an independent nonprofit since 2016, and I've been there since 2018, and we work broadly on different kinds of projects, some of them in other. And really, we believe in trying to create digital spaces, online spaces, for communities to sort of,
share in conversation and debate, have exposure to information, and sort of how do you expose people to information that gets through some of the boundaries that we're all very familiar with in digital spaces and how people consume information. So we're really like this nonprofit that is built for the digital age, trying to use digital spaces to do good in the world. So, we've worked in Canada on different projects around social cohesion, around disinformation, around health-related risks. And we sort of try to get around the harmful effects, I would say, of digital spaces that are fueled by algorithms that are there to increase your consumption. And again, I'm not going to go through that spiel because you're all familiar with it. My personal story, I've been at this nonprofit for about 7 years. I took on the role of CEO of this nonprofit on October 1st, 2023. Leading with my name, like there's a bit of difficulty there, and so when people ask me like, how's this role been for you? I can't separate those two things, right? And you can imagine that it sometimes has been very complicated to navigate what it's like leading an organization that is out there in the world, trying to advance human rights, trying to build bridges. In this room, I'll say, I jokingly say that like if there's a manual of how to be a first-time CEO and it says somewhere that on week 3 you're supposed to cry in front of everybody, then like I'm doing great. I'm on my way. But in all seriousness, I was born in Tel Aviv, born and raised in Tel Aviv to my Canadian parents. So I've always been like this hybrid, 2 languages, dual citizenship. Spent until my early 30s there, but since then I made a choice to be here. But I still feel very strongly like I have this Israeli identity, but I'm also very, very strongly like my Jewish Canadian identity because my whole family is actually here and not there. And I have to say that it's been a journey to better understand those 2 identities and those 2 pieces. And since October 7th, like those 2 identities, right, are different, but in some ways they're connected. And every conversation I have, I need to check myself, which identity sort of am I leading with? Sorry, I think I went off cards. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
So there's a lot going on here, notes, glasses, talking with my hands and a mic, so we'll see how this goes. I want to add my thank you to the coordinators of the conference and to this group and panel. We had a first conversation that was so enriching, and I'm really excited for the conversation that is to come. And it's also so nice to look out into this room and see friends and supporters and mentors in this room, so there's a lot of gratitude. And as I begin sort of my personal story and the work we do, I truly appreciated the framework of this session, that at a time when everything feels so dark and polarized and divided, and what we see and hear in the news being reported are more and more stories of harm, and increasing rates of anti-Semitism, and all that is true. And also, there is hope. There are spaces where educators are standing up for students, where administrators have the tools they need to do the work that they need to do to ensure that students are safe and feel that they can show up as their full selves in school spaces. And so I want to do 2 things today, both to recognize and name the rate that anti-Semitism that we see in our spaces, and also to try to elevate some hope and to tell stories of the work that I'm so grateful to get to do in schools, supporting educators and administrators and school leaders in the work that I do with Facing History and Ourselves. Because you heard in my little bio that we are using lessons of history. We work within curriculum to help create spaces where young people learn that their roles, that they, even as young people, have the power to create change. That we don't have to take what we see around us for granted. We don't have to get swept up with the trends that we see, but we can actually support young people to stand up. Our tagline, I think, is even better than our mission statement. It's people make choices, choices make history. And so how can we help young people who sometimes feel no power in the world to recognize that their choices matter? And we do that through the lessons of history. We work closely with teachers, supporting them not only with curriculum, but also with the tools and the strategies to create the spaces where deep learning can happen. And so the organization began in 1976. Long before I was around to do this work, and so many, I stand on the shoulders of incredible educators, both in the United States, but here in Canada and in Toronto, the old Toronto board, who started doing this work in the early 80s. I was lucky enough to come here in 2006 and start bringing the program here. And where we started as an organization was looking at the history, the case study of the Holocaust. And even, especially 1970s, 80s, what our leaders, Margot Stern-Strom, what she recognized, our founder, was that there was a misperception that the Nazis created anti-Semitism. And we know that not to be true. And paired with a misconception that the Holocaust ended anti-Semitism, and we certainly know that that is not true. And so we started taking a long lens of history, beginning to help educators and therefore their students, the teachers are our levers of change, how to help them recognize that the long history of anti-Semitism, beginning with anti-Judaism, and recognizing the tropes and how they evolve over time. At the same time, we were recognizing that learning spaces have to be created with purpose and intent and specific strategies to create spaces where those students can actually talk about these hard histories. And the pairing of those two pieces, a depth of scholarship, understanding and being able to teach about the historic trope, how those historic tropes play out over time and manifest and morph in different ways, impacting Jewish communities, and strategies to help students show up as their full selves. It is for those two reasons that we are at the table in meaningful ways supporting schools in responding to anti-Semitism. And I'm looking forward to having more of a conversation. I just want to say very quickly 3 things that I think add to the reason why we are able to be supporting school boards in the way we are. The first is that we've been working in equity spaces since the early 80s. The first educators who brought us in were working in equity spaces in the old Toronto board. And so we had those trusted relationships. We are not a Jewish organization. We look at the history of the Holocaust as both in the particulars of the experience of Jewish people, but also as a universal watershed event and how we can learn. And as a non-Jewish organization, while I am Jewish identifying, my colleague who I co-facilitate is not Jewish. Jasmine Wong co-facilitates closely with me, modeling allyship. And also what we've learned from disability activists, the nothing about us without us. So I'm always there speaking as a Jewish person. We are not a Jewish organization, we are also not an advocacy organization. And so we bring a lens of education at the forefront. And finally is that depth of scholarship and trusted relationship with educators that allows us to be a trusted partner in these spaces.
Thank you. As you can see, we have a very deep well of knowledge and experience here, and I'm excited to jump in. So I want to start, and a couple of you already touched on this a little bit. I want to know, what are some common misconceptions about anti-Semitism that you have encountered in your work? Leora, you've already mentioned a little bit. Do you want to continue?
Yeah. Sure.
So we've been doing this work in schools for a long time, before October 7th. We were supporting TDSB and other school systems in providing professional learning opportunities for their teachers. And I truly would have said and really believed that educators would see something, administrators would see something, and they would turn a blind eye. They would make a choice to not support that family or that child. And if it wasn't a swastika or a Heil Hitler, which is hard to say isn't anti-Semitic, they would turn a blind eye. And in doing this work since October 7th, we have been on the ground supporting schools, coming in where there are incidents, but also proactively helping school systems create spaces where educators recognize. The recognizing is the thing. So my misconception, my misunderstanding was that really educators and superintendents, they were just turning a blind eye. I actually think that they're not seeing it. So a young person or a family would say, this is anti-Semitic, and they just don't see it. And what we're hearing from teachers on the ground is things like, I thought, we'll go in and we take exit cards and surveys afterwards. I thought that I was fighting something that started on October 7th. And now I understand that this is a much longer history. So for people in this room, that might be shocking to think, but that's the reality of what people know. And even if there is that's an extreme, but even if there is a sense that anti-Semitism, obviously there's a long history, but if you don't know the tropes, if you can't see the tropes, you can't recognize it, you can't combat it, you can't respond to it. So that's, I think, one really important thing. I also think that it is, I think that there's sort of popular feeling that it's easy to be a teacher. Like, I can't, like, I don't know, and I hear this from people who I'm working with, like, oh, summer's off, and like, isn't this so great? It is so hard, and it is becoming harder and harder. So when we have a situation where teachers feel so nervous to do things, I just really think that the support that teachers need, so that misperception, it's not specifically about anti-Semitism, those two pieces really, teachers need support, they need to be able to recognize, because I really have to say, no teacher, teachers do not wake up in the morning and say, like, I'm gonna go cause harm today. They're not. They're really not. The vast majority of teachers are not. But they're not recognizing at times the impact of their actions, and they're not seeing what the students and what the families are seeing. So that's a piece that I wanted to bring up.
That's important to understand that educators need educating.
Absolutely.
Right? And we can't expect people who haven't necessarily had the lived experience to know what it is to even look for. So thank you for bringing that up.
Keep going. I'll say, so the reason I'm on this panel is because for the last almost 2 years, Digital Public Square has been working on a project that looks at hate towards Jews in Canada, hate towards Muslims in Canada, and more recently sort of focuses much more on polarization. Excuse me. And I spend a lot of time thinking about misconceptions, right? And, to Leora's point, if you don't know, how do you interpret a situation if you don't know? Or equally, how do you interpret a situation if you're hypersensitive, right? And if you think about the idea of like, what is a misconception, right? There's an assumption there. Sorry, I'm gonna also take on and put off. There's an assumption there that a misconception is an idea that you form that is based on something that is like faulty or wrong, right? And I think that when we're talking about something so sensitive like how a Jewish person understands
or any person, right? But specifically now we're talking about a Jewish person understands hate or their perception of risk. It is like based on such a complex set of factors, right? That go, I can speak for myself, like when I see something and I'm like, is that okay? Is that not okay? And I start interrogating it, right? And trying to understand it. And it's based on my like intergenerational trauma. My mother is a Holocaust survivor. That weighs a lot sort of in my family history. It's based on how I was raised. Again, specifically for me in Israel and not in Canada. That creates a difference for me. It's based on, your personal experiences. And so I think that this idea that sometimes people have that like there's a misconception and that you can just anchor in like truth or in something accurate, to me that's almost useless, right? And so we spend our time sort of trying to figure out what are those things though, what are those forces that influence how a person interprets a situation, and how can we try to balance those out, whether it's educating people so they're more educated to understand, or whether it's some form of, increasing some critical, like the capacity for some thinking that actually will bring the temperature down. I would say that, again, in this space of the polarized environment that we're living in, and I want to say again, that's not entirely anti-Semitism, but there's a relationship there, right? The environment that we're seeing around us is how we see it and how we interpret it is likely causing us to react in a certain way and to interpret certain situations that would likely fall in or out of what every person considers anti-Semitism, right? And that line is not the same. I'm sure that line is not the same for me, for Leora, for Ella, for most people in the crowd. Like it's a very personal line. And so I take great care, I really do, whenever I see something, to really interrogate it and to interrogate like what that is and also what makes me react in a certain way that I'm reacting. And honestly, like that's not great. To sort of that you have to do it, and sometimes I'm sometimes it makes me mad even that you have to do it. But the truth is, again, anti-Semitism is very real. Don't get me wrong, right? But I think our perceptions are somewhere in there. I can say from our line of work, I would contend that there was maybe a bit of an inflated sense of safety that the Jewish community had before October 7th. Because the truth is that if you look at hate crime data, it's been going up since, there are many experts in the crowd, one of them is right there, but from before October 7th, for sure, right? I think from 2020, there's been an increase, right? But and so is that sense that we had before because we weren't worried about it informing how we feel now? For sure it is, but also does that matter? Because Jewish people feel the way they feel and their sense of safety has been shattered, and that's what we have to deal with now. And so bringing all this back, I just want to say the idea of a misconception is in itself maybe not the right thing, because at the end of the day I feel the way I feel and I perceive the risk the way I perceive it. I do have a couple of data points to share, but maybe I'll first hand it over to Ella, and then
I think that there are, of course, misconceptions about anti-Semitism and the nature of anti-Semitism that exists today, but I actually think a common misconception that I've encountered in my work is a misconception internal to the Jewish community, the Jewish advocacy community. And that's the idea that if there's someone that we don't agree with, or maybe someone that says something potentially problematic, that we should label them a horrible anti-Semite and we should never engage with them again, and they are done, we're not engaging. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, and I want to be really clear about that. And it's possible that I am just too optimistic, but I would make the point that I think most people want to work with us. I think most people agree, Jewish or non-Jewish, agree that anti-Semitism is a problem and that we have to combat it. And so if we give in to the idea that we are alone in this, that our community is alone, we're just hurting ourselves. Isolation is a tool of extremists. And because of that, isolation is something that isn't going to save us.
Secondly, I would also add that debate and nuance and dialogue are pillars of a strong democracy. And so, again, like I said before, there are certainly exceptions to the rule that I just named, but at the same time, in order to preserve our safety as Jews and the safety of the world around us, we have to be able to preserve our ability to engage in real nuanced dialogue about anti-Semitism, about the war, about the conflict, because that's something that at the end of the day is going to protect democracy and keep Jews safe.
Thank you. I think, yes, go ahead. I think what we're hearing here, just in response to that very first question, is the idea that we're not necessarily dealing with just facts here, and that there's so many other layers, and this is not a question of black and white. And we have to remain open to all of the different shades that are going on here, what's happening inside of us, our guts and our reactions, and what our brains know, and what the way we interact with each other. So on that level, I want to talk a little bit about how anti-Semitism is being discussed in public discourse. And Shlomit, I want to start with you, because I think there's a lot that we're hearing in media, what we're hearing in online discourse, versus what we're seeing on the ground. And maybe they're the same and maybe they're not. That's why you're here as the expert. So, not specifically a pointed question, but an open invitation for a conversation about how is anti-Semitism being discussed, and what are our ways of engaging with that discourse?
I'll just pick up, and I'll connect the previous and this one, just going back to how we see the environment, because I think this is fueled by it. Again, I spend a lot of time studying sort of social media and the impacts of the digital world, right? And if you think of the world I used to live in, when I was younger, I was very much exposed to and aware of sort of what happens in the world around me, but really in my neighborhood, my friends, my different circles, work. And of course, there was things that came mediated through formal media, right? But the truth is, you most of the time lived your life and you weren't exposed to really crazy things in your environment. And then the world changed on us, right? And now I can get so worked up and consumed by something that some person who lives miles away from me, thousands of miles away from me, said about something because a friend of mine who's obsessed with those ideas sent it to me and thinks it's really important for me to look at it. And now I'm freaked out, and it's almost like comical, but the truth is, think about it. You're constantly exposed to these things that are happening I don't know that our mental capacity or emotional capacity was ever built for that, for like the full world, full on, all the time, right? And so on one hand you could say, oh, it's important to know what's out there, to be vigilant, but on the other hand, is that informing how I am now interpreting the environment around me and sort of my tolerance for risk? You can be sure it is. We, as part of our work, just completed a national survey about polarization in Canada about the issue of Israel-Gaza. And there's some fascinating pieces of information that came back about that, and I want to share a couple of them. So this was a nationally representative survey of Canadians with oversampling of Jews and Muslims. That's the other thing I will say. The work that we do focuses also on Muslim communities, Palestinian communities, and Jewish communities. If you ask Canadians, right, what percentage of Canadians, so 3 in 10 Canadians think that Canada is very polarized at the moment about Israel-Gaza. 3 in 10 Canadians. If you ask the Jewish community, sorry, I shouldn't say the Jewish community, Jewish respondents, 7 out of 10 responded that that Canada is very polarized around this issue of Israel-Gaza. That is a huge difference, right? And so Jewish people are perceiving an environment that is extremely, extremely polarized around them. And that obviously is informing all the decisions that they're making. Sorry. I'm going to stop here for a second. I do have a couple more pieces of information, but I want to share. Sure. Yeah.
Do you want us to, so let me pick up on this divide, because I think when we think about what schools need to combat anti-Semitism, they certainly need support and professional learning on the historic trope and how they manifest and morph to fit different moments in time and how that impacts the Jewish community. That's tremendously important. But in our work, we've learned that there are 3 additional learnings that are critical. One is around who Jewish people are and the intersectionality and the diversity of the Jewish community. That's really important. It's important to find places in the curriculum to infuse Jewish joy and stories of resilience rather than stories purely of Holocaust and trauma and perpetuation of violence. We need to find places where Jewish stories are told of vibrancy. We also need media literacy, right? Young people need to learn how to navigate that information that's coming at them, those emails, although that's not how young people are accessing it. That's my life, but in your life, you're getting the emails, they're not getting emails, but they're being hit, and our social media just continues to perpetuate, you click on one thing. But the 4th is really important. The 4th is how to facilitate spaces where dialogue can happen, where we can talk about hard things. And that, we had been doing work on civil discourse, but we are, for years, since the beginning, we were thinking about, how do we talk with one another in school spaces? As our world becomes further and further divided, further and further polarized, actually, and post October 7th, all those tools we had were not holding our spaces. Our classrooms were not able to talk. Teachers were terrified about what happens when something comes in from the outside. If our classrooms can't be spaces where we move away from this polarization, that's deeply, deeply concerning. And so we started doing work on a new framework to hold dialogue, to allow teachers to talk with their students about what's happening in the world. We need our spaces to be able to do that. And I truly, what we see is with the right tools, young people can have hard conversations about the hardest topics like Israel-Palestine and Gaza, and not experience harm, not cause harm, but learn how to listen to people who have different lived experiences, different perspectives, and that is incredibly important when we see data, and more data that you're going to be sharing, but the data that shows how we are seeing the world differently, how we continue to live in these echo chambers. And I mean, I'm a little biased because of our work, but I truly, it has to be schools where we correct this, where young people learn to talk across difference and talk with one another. I'm curious, I would love to see data from you that show like what happened, that's the thing, like what happens in the future when all of the kids get facing history and they're out in the world, and what happens in those, in that future that we can dream about.
Before we move on, Leora, can I just ask you, you said new tools.
Yeah.
What are the new tools?
So
just one new tool.
One new tool. So we have a new framework that we've been working on called, it's the Quad of Dialogue. It's 4 corners that hold us in conversation. We're working on it, we're trying it with classrooms and teachers in our professional learning, but the 4 corners are, first of all, that this isn't a debate. We're not trying to convince one another. I'm gonna go quick. So come find me afterwards if you want to talk more about this. it's not a debate. I'm not trying to convince you of my opinion. It's not about winning an argument. It's about being open to all possibilities. We enter in with humility. Humility meaning I don't have all the answers. When I don't have all the answers, it opens up to curiosity. You talked about curiosity and the importance. When I ask questions of another person and we look at each other in this conversation, it builds empathy. That's the third. Humility, curiosity, empathy. And then the fourth is understanding that it's not going to be perfect. I need to be able to sit with discomfort. If somebody says something racist, harmful, I can leave. I do not need to stay. But I need to be able to sit with the discomfort of hearing another opinion that's different than my own without tapping out of complexity, sitting with that. And those four corners, and what we're hearing from teachers is that in a course at the TDSB called Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity, where you have to be having hard conversations, using this tool allowed, I mean, this is a case study of one, but using this tool allowed for dialogue to happen, for everyone to leave at the end of that class, according to this teacher, with not feeling harmed, and there were no parental complaints on Monday morning, and that's like the check. To me, that's the like win. So if we can do that more, that brings me hope.
Ella, I do want to move to you. I want to add another layer to this conversation, just also noticing the time and name the elephant in the room, as it were, and open this conversation up just a little bit more. There's some statistics that have already been shared and will be continually shared throughout the day that I want to reiterate here. And in the recent survey that the New Israel Fund and JSpace did of Canadian Jews, there's a really interesting statistic. I'm going to read it to you. 84% of Canada's Jews say they are very or somewhat emotionally attached to Israel. 94% support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. But 51% of Canadian Jews consider themselves Zionist. 94% support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. 51% call themselves Zionists. So just to keep adding layers to this conversation, I'm curious what that gap tells us about identity, about language, about belonging, and if we are so brave in our remaining time to even delve into the question of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. And I want to open that up. Ella, I think you're the right person for this.
So I think, I feel very brave opening this up. I think the first thing that the gap in that data shows us is that there are many, many different ways to define Zionism. So to give a personal example, I am someone who was raised within Jewish institutions. I went to a Jewish day school in America. I went to Jewish summer camp. I belonged to a synagogue growing up. And so because of that, I have a personal definition of what Zionism means to me. But that being said, everyone in this room has a personal definition of Zionism and what Zionism means to them. And so, I mean, to draw a pretty direct comparison, I'm going to have a vastly different definition of Zionism than, say, a Palestinian who was born and is currently living in the West Bank. And that doesn't mean that my definition is more right. It doesn't mean that their definition is more right. But it does mean that we have to find a way to be able to sit with both of those definitions and have an understanding that both of those definitions are coming from personal experience. And then to delve a little bit more into the anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism question, at the outset, not all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think that's really important to note at the beginning. So anti-Zionist critique, I mean, the most notable that comes to mind is the anti-Zionist critique that I'm anti-Zionist because thousands of Palestinians were displaced when Israel was established in 1948. I would say that that's not anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionist critique that calls for government reform in Israel, that calls for more humanitarian aid to be led into Gaza, that calls for even restrictions or conditions on arms deals to Israel. None of that is anti-Semitic.
it's a political position that you can be rightfully opposed to, but I think we have to be really intentional about when and where we use the term anti-Semitism. But that being established, I think it's also really important to note that anti-Zionism can pretty easily cross the line into anti-Semitic territory, and it does that when it invokes specifically anti-Semitic tropes, when it blames Jews or Israelis, or when it blames Jews or Israelis or even the state of Israel for catastrophes around the world, when it scapegoats the Jewish community and Israelis, when it engages in conspiracy theories. And again, that being established, I also think it's really important that we really hold tight to that line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I mean, not just for the safety of democracy around the world, but frankly for the safety of democracy in Israel and the future of the state of Israel. Breaking down those lines is something that pretty quickly results in attacks on democracy. You can see that very easily in America right now with Project Esther. Breaking down the lines between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is getting us to a place where student activists are deported, where our universities are being attacked, when DEI is being attacked. It's pretty clear to me, specifically from Project Esther, that the answer is not blurring lines between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The answer has to be protecting democracy and protecting those lines above all else.
Yeah.
I think this is exactly the space of where you see something and you need to interrogate it, right? And I've seen examples of things that I assumed were, I see these as two arenas that have a relationship between them, clearly. And it's sometimes very complicated, right? I've had moments where I've seen something and I thought, oh, this belongs in this arena. And after further interrogation and sometimes even consultation, I figured out, no, I actually think this is in the other space, right? And again, I wish life was more simple, but these are very, very complex issues and how they sort of interplay with each other. For me, just on a personal note, again, this is where I run higher on my Israeli temperature. I never, like growing up, I never had to figure out what's my relationship with this concept. It was a thing of the past that we learned in history class, right? I never had to locate myself with Zionism. I never spent a minute thinking about that, to be honest with you, right? I knew Zionism only when it was combined with another word, which was either the religious Zionist movement in Israel, which was like fringe to me, or anti-Zionist, which was even more fringe to me. And in the last 2 years, suddenly I've been asked this question, and I've been perplexed. I spent months dreading that question because I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. And I will also tell you that in my work, several times, when asked, I said, wait, what does that mean to you? Like, if you tell me what it means to you, I'm happy to tell you, right? I'm not trying to run away. And I've heard vastly different definitions, right? Including some that I'm miles and miles away from being that person who believes in certain ways that it was defined to me. I think it's really, really important. I've seen cases where those two things are conflated, cases where it's one, but in fact it's masking the other. And I will also say, some of the things that I've seen online people say about Zionists are just way beyond the pale, right? And should not be said about any political movement, and definitely not if you're using it as as a way to sort of say Jews, but you don't want to say Jews because that's not okay. And equally, I've seen so many things that were defined as anti-Semitic, including from very close friends of mine, that I'm, again, in my interpretation, I don't see them, I have a lot to say about the current Israeli government or the Israeli state, and I'm not afraid to say it. I didn't grow up with that thing that is like, we have to protect that state. To me, that state is very real and it makes horrible mistakes. And I think it's actually important for us to call that out, right? I absolutely do not agree with the idea that we should not be calling that I'll say a word about belonging. I think it's really important. Going back to my survey, I protect myself with numbers. 70% of Jews in our survey said that they feel nostalgic to how Canada used to be. 70%. In the general population, that number was 53%, so 53% of Canadians said that they're nostalgic. 52% of Muslim respondents said they're nostalgic. 70% of Jews said they are nostalgic to what Canada used to be. 55% of Jews said, this is all the same story, 55% of Jews says they don't feel like they can express themselves in mainstream society. 55%. General population, 43% of Canadians, 40% of Muslims said that. 50% of Jews said that the war in Ukraine and Gaza doesn't impact Canada, okay? Doesn't impact Canada, whereas only 20% of Canadians said that and 26% of Muslims. And, sorry, I'll tie this all together, and 88% of Jews said that it impacts their daily life, right? Whereas that's only 46% of Canadians and only 26% of Muslims. And so just tying this back together, if you think of what Jews are telling us, right, how they're feeling right now in Canada, they are nostalgic about what it used to be like. They don't feel like they can express themselves in this moment in mainstream society, right? They don't think that, again, you could debate this, right? But they don't think that this war impacts Canada as a country, right? And they are highly affected by it in their daily life, right? And so I just think that this, at the moment, again, you could, surveys are interesting and data is data. And then there's also sometimes framing of data, right? So like, you can't take it as exactly for truth. But I do think this tells a story of how people are feeling. I think Jewish people are feeling, I mean, we know this, very, very unsettled in Canada, and their sense of belonging has been highly, highly impacted. And we have to figure out how to make them feel better and not do that at the expense of other communities.
Thank you. We are in our final 2 minutes. So I know this time goes very quickly. So Leora, I want to turn to you a little bit for this conversation and for our final statements, and we'll sort of do that all in one. And then we have been talking a little bit about helping educators understand that line between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, but I'm going to let you. Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Fix it all for
And
us.
I'm going to take this so you can actually hear me. Belonging. I'm going to pick up on belonging. That is, and the feeling of belonging. So, and try to connect this to your question and wrap it all up. So, it is very real that some Jewish students and families, many, we just saw a report that came out from the federal government through, that was published on anti-Semitism in schools in Ontario, K through 12. And the story that's told in that is a story of a lack of sense of belonging. We heard those stories. It is very true that even in spaces where the line isn't crossed between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that Jewish students and families can still feel unsafe. And that we have to sit with. And so we have to recognize, for example, when there is a school walkout where we want students to be involved and engaged, and when students choose to walk out in support of a Free Palestine movement, that is not anti-Semitic, and we can ensure that there are no placards that are anti-Semitic, and the educators in those spaces can work with students to make sure that what they're saying is not anti-Semitic. And at the same time, administrators and teachers need to be able to support students that in those moments still do not feel safe and do not feel a sense of belonging. So how can we do those two things at the same time? We can and we have to, because our students have to feel a sense of belonging in schools. When they don't feel a sense of belonging, that is when students leave, that is when they don't show up, that is when they can't succeed academically, because they're putting too much effort into concealing who they are, hiding who they are. And so we're not only just talking about, schools need to be safe spaces because students need to feel a sense of warmth and love and support. Yes, all of that. But if they don't feel that, they leave and they can't learn. And that's ultimately what's at stake.
Thank you. So we do need to wrap things up. So I want to give you each one word about your organization so that we can find you, and then I'll give our closing thoughts and let everyone go off for lunch.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think I'm just reflecting on this experience. I think it's likely important that one of the things that I make sure we do is package some of this interesting data with some commentary and succeed to somehow share it more broadly. One thing I'm also reflecting on is how do we bring this very complex, nuanced, area to younger generations. We really need to figure out how to engage young people in this discourse, because I'm afraid we're losing them a little bit, and I'm constantly frustrated sort of by the fact that, anyways, we need to figure out how to bring them into this room.
So I'm just gonna kind of rattle off a bunch of resources that the Nexus project has that I think can be a really helpful continuation of this conversation. These are all on our website, which is nexusproject.us. We have the Nexus document that has the Nexus definition of anti-Semitism, which is one of the leading definitions of anti-Semitism in the United States, and it was referenced in the 2023 national strategy by the Biden administration. There's the Nexus Campus Guide, which is specifically focused on unpacking a lot of the speech that we're seeing on college campuses around the world these days, and determining when and where it can cross the line into anti-Semitism. There's a really helpful, long but very helpful graph with some examples of that speech. There's our strategy for combating anti-Semitism during the Trump era. And then finally, there's also a Project Esther briefing that is a really helpful summary of Project Esther and what it means for Jews and democracy around the world.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for thank all of you for leaning into this complex conversation. We understand, we all know that anti-Semitism cannot be reduced to slogans. It demands nuance and courage and honesty, as you've all shown us today. I hope you all leave here with better questions and deeper insight and a renewed commitment to careful listening and coalition building. And I really want to encourage you all to learn more about these organizations. We're all going to be here throughout the day. So support these organizations with your time, promote them to your networks, and let's continue this essential work of combating anti-Semitism and strengthening our communities. Thank you all for being here.